most delicious meatball you'll ever have. So these are the juiciest, most tender, most succulent, most custardy, most delicious meatballs you'll ever have. These are red braised Chinese lion's head meatballs. So we start by frying to set the exterior, and then we braise it in an aromatic red braising liquid. And it's braised for a super long time, which breaks down all that collagen, all that connective tissue, all the fat, so it's super custardy, super soft. You can spoon into it or break it apart with your chopsticks, but it's also got this bouncy texture on the outside, so it's kind of like a paradox. The result is the most delicious meatball you'll ever have. All right, so we're going to start by processing our pork belly. So I've got some offcuts of skinless pork belly. Ideally, you want to have a pork belly that's got about 5 layers of alternating fat and meat. In Chinese, that's called mfayok, which literally translates to 5-flour meat. But yeah, just generally an even distribution of fat and lean meat, so that makes a really nice meatball, about 50-50. So we'll just start up by breaking this down into 1-inch cubes. Typically, lion's head meatballs are made by hand mincing the meat with 2 cleavers, but that tends to be a really labor-intensive process. For cooks at home, it's actually easier to just either buy ground pork belly, which you can ask from your butcher, or you can grind your own at home if you have a food processor. So this is pretty much that process here. So we're gonna cut these into 1-inch cubes, we're gonna freeze them, and then we're gonna process them in a food processor, which gets it pretty close to a ground meat texture. That's that, and we're done. So we've got our half sheet. We're just gonna spread this into an even single layer. Really use the full surface area of the sheet pan. Make sure everything is pretty much separated. You don't have to go crazy. And we're gonna transfer this to the freezer and freeze it for about 30 minutes, up to 2 hours, until it's nice and firm. So it's been about 30 minutes, and as you can hear and see, these pieces have firmed up a little bit. They're not like super like extra frozen, but they're definitely firm. So this is at a good spot and we can process this. So it's pretty simple here. We're gonna go a little bit at a time. You don't wanna overwhelm the blade of the processor. So we're gonna take about 1/4 of this meat, just straight in. And then we're gonna go slow. So really, this is all about pulsing. So we're gonna go for about 25 to 30 pulses, I would say. All right, so that was about 25 pulses. It pretty much resembles ground meat. So maybe a little bit even finer, but it's definitely separated. It's not smeared together or really cohesive, sticky ground pork texture. It's nice and loose and friable to me. So this looks really nice. So we're just gonna park this in our bowl here. It's a nice landing spot. And we'll continue processing. And that's our ground pork belly situation. Again, it's nice and loose, friable. It's not melting on my hands just yet, still cold because we left it in the freezer before we processed it. And this is ready to mix into meatballs. So now we're ready to mix our meatball mixture. And for that, we're gonna start with a really savory base. So we got some light soy sauce here. Some potato starch, which is gonna help to bind everything together, but also to emulsify all the fat and meat, as well as bind water. So the meatball will actually be a little juicier in the end. We've also got some Shaoxing wine, a good amount of sugar, water, salt, white pepper, oyster sauce, and finally a little bit of baking soda. Similar to the potato starch, helps to bind a little bit more water. It also prevents the meat from contracting too much and cross-linking a lot, which leads to a more tender, more juicy meatball overall. So we're just gonna give this a nice whisk just to get everything distributed, get all that potato starch well hydrated. At this point, we can go in with our pork. Just gonna go straight in. Pork's in, and we've got some scallion and some grated ginger, some minced water chestnut, and that's gonna add a lot of nice, pleasant texture to the meatball. A little tiny bit of crunch, but it's really refreshing. And lastly, we've got 2 eggs. All right, at this point, we're just gonna start this slow. Get everything distributed. Gonna increase the speed. And what I'm looking for here is for the meat to sort of get a little bit streaky, a little bit stickier, a little more cohesive. And that's as you're paddling the meat, that agitation is leaching out some myosin, which is leading to a more emulsified meatball. So compared to like a traditional Italian meatball, where you might wanna like underwork the meat so it's nice and tender, here we're intentionally overworking the meat, which is leaching out myosin, which leads to sort of a bouncy texture that's characteristic of these meatballs. All right, and that's pretty much done. I can tell because as it really got going, it was starting to stick to itself and run around the sides of the bowl, and that's a good indicator for a good stopping point. So all we gotta do is transfer this out back to our bowl. It's gonna be really sticky. If you want, you can wet your hands before this step. That'll keep the meat from sticking to your hands too much. And at this point, I'm just gonna transfer all of this out. And now it's ready to portion into our meatballs. We've got our meatball mixture ready to go. It's gonna go straight into portioning. Take a bowl of the same size, put it on the scale, tear it, and then just swap it out with our meatball mixture. That's about 1,380 grams. So that comes out to about 170 grams per portion if I'm making 8 meatballs. So quick and dirty way to do that. As far as portioning goes, I like to have a landing spot. So this is a half sheet with parchment sprayed down liberally with cooking spray. I've got my scale so I can portion, a little sheet tray sprayed with cooking spray as well so things don't stick. And then lastly, a container of really cold water. And that's gonna help so that the meat doesn't stick to my hands as I'm working through it. So we'll just get into this. One note that I've had or been taught is to tell the proper texture of the meatball is you wanna pick it up and actually throw it against the side of the bowl. This is a cooking technique in Chinese called da, which basically means to hit. And you're constantly kind of hitting the meat. And it's simulating that paddling motion that we had in the stand mixer. It's also just a tactile way to figure out the right texture of the meat. So anyway, we're gonna wet our hands, weigh out 170, pretty good. And just lightly sort of form these meatballs and just plop them down. So as I'm working with this is a very, very soft mixture. It's soft, but it's light. And so we have to work pretty quickly in order for the fat not to melt, but also it's important to work cold. So right after we're done portioning these, we're gonna stick them into the freezer so they can firm up so we can handle them even more for frying. And that's a good tip in general when working with like a high fat proportion meats. It's really important to work cold, especially for emulsified mixtures like this. The term lion's head actually refers to the guardian lions that are sort of adorning the entranceways of temples and palaces in China. And these meatballs are said to resemble the heads, big, round, sort of majestic. They're usually served during really celebratory times. So Lunar New Year is a really good example, Mid-Autumn Festival. They're considered a very auspicious dish. I'm really not trying to roll the meatball in my hand, really. I'm just kind of using gravity to form the meatball and letting the meat do the work. It's similar to making actually certain styles of meatballs, like Western meatballs, where you don't want to overwork the meat. But in this case, it's just because the meat itself, this mixture is so soft, so delicate, so sticky, that I really don't want to be working it through my fingers and hands to the point that it sticks. So the particular type of cuisine that this meatball comes from in China is known for very subtle flavors, not spicy, not aggressive. And it's also known for using one ingredient, such as pork, and applying really specific technique like knife cuts, for instance. Traditionally, this would be hand chopped. And so that's the big technique that makes it unique. But instead of hand chopping here, we're just using the food processor to fast track things. We're all set here. Our meatballs are portioned. They're all pretty much the same size, within 170 grams, give or take. We're just gonna pop these into the freezer so they firm up before we go fry. We have frozen our meatballs at least 30 minutes here. And at this point, they're a bit firmer to the touch, so you can kind of handle them. I've got about 3 inches, 2.5 inches of oil in this wok, heated it to 350 degrees. And we're gonna be frying these until they're golden brown. And we're not frying these long enough to cook them through. In fact, they're gonna be totally raw in the center. This is just to set the exterior. You'll notice they're a little bit flat out of the freezer, so I like to just form them again a little bit. So obviously you don't want to be just dropping these from high, otherwise you're just gonna splash a bunch of oil on yourself. So I like to go in from the side. And the wok is really nice for that because it has tall sides. It's also sloped out, so you can actually use it as a slide to go in. So I'm really not dropping into the oil so much as just gently sliding them into the oil. Really important here, in the first 30 seconds, I'm just gonna give these a little bit of a turn, a little bit of a move so that they don't stick to the bottom of the wok. Just gentle here. Just get a little bit of movement. And then I'm gonna fry these for about 6 minutes, turning them every minute or so they get evenly browned all over. Meanwhile, I've got these 4 extra meatballs. I'm actually gonna stick them back into the freezer because I don't want them to get too soft. These are starting to float, which tells me they're definitely cooking, but I'm giving them a turn just to get an even distribution, even contact, even cook. The frying step here is really nice because it sets the exterior. If I was just to blanch this in water, they don't tend to hold up as well. So it's really important here to fry them. The second thing is that frying creates this sort of brown crust, which when you glaze them with a brown sauce kind of amplifies that color. So you get a really, really nice appearance to it. All right, so it's been about 6 minutes. These are about ready to take out of the fryer. So this looks nice and beautiful, nice and browned. Don't have to go crazy at this step because we're gonna be braising these next. It's really just to set the exterior, to set that shape, give it a little bit extra color. And then we'll continue with our next 4 meatballs that are in the freezer. Last 4 are in. We're gonna fry these for about 6 minutes. And anytime you're dropping things into a fryer, especially like big chunky meatballs or lots of something, you're always gonna have a temperature drop. If you're working on a home range, on a gas stove, for example, you might wanna adjust the intensity of your flame. Say jack it up to high if it's really dipped low, get it back up to that range. Using the piece of equipment like this, it's really easy. It tends to just gain really quickly. So these are done. We're just gonna transfer them out. Now you might notice they look done. They look nice and golden brown on the outside, but these are not cooked fully through yet. Especially so because we're using pork belly, which has a lot of connective tissue, A lot of unrendered fat. That all needs to get broken down in order for us to really enjoy this meatball. Otherwise, if I bit into this, it probably wouldn't be a very pleasant experience. So these are done, these are fried, these are ready to get braised. So we're gonna start building our braising liquid for our meatballs. It's a pretty intense aromatic base that's gonna provide a lot of extra flavor to the meatballs. But first we're gonna add some oil, so about 2 teaspoons. Let that heat up, get it nice and shimmering. The importance of this braising liquid here is A, to really flavor the meatballs a little bit more, but B, to really break down all that connective tissue, all of that fat, and render these meatballs into something that's really succulent, really juicy, really tender, and just an amazing experience overall. All right, our pan's heated, our oil's heated, in we go with our veg. So some scallions, some ginger, a little bit of garlic. These are all whole aromatics. I don't really care about having them minced or anything like that. I just want them for the flavor. We'll be straining these out later. We're just looking to get some good color on both sides before we go in with our sauces and our liquids and things like that. Technically, this is a red braise, and red braising is a really common technique in Chinese cuisine. It's used for all kinds of meats like red braised pork belly, but it also applied to things like eggs or vegetables, and it generally refers to the color of the meat. It's not actually red. Traditionally, some recipes have used things like red fermented bean paste to get some of that color, but these days, most of the time, the color comes from that combination of dark soy sauce and light soy sauce, and even oyster sauce. So it's a really more of a dark, burnished color. All right, so our vegetables are nice and browned. We're gonna go in with some Shaoxing wine. Let that cook off a little bit. Really fragrant. Some light soy. Dark soy. That gives us that nice color. And some oyster sauce. Let this cook down slightly. It's gonna be sputtering a bit. At this point, I'm gonna go right in with some chicken stock or chicken broth. So I'm getting a lot of intense aromas here. Definitely the soy, but also that Shaoxing wine. So it's very aromatic, it's very sharp, very savory sort of aroma to it. So we've gone in with our chicken broth. We're gonna go in with our sugar, some sesame oil, a little bit more salt, some white pepper, and some chicken powder. So chicken powder is sort of a not so secret ingredient in Chinese cooking. It's used all over the place to add a little bit more umami, a little bit more complexity. To me, I think it's worth using. People like my parents kind of frown upon it. They think it's not, legit. But I really like the flavor, and it gives you that restaurant quality to the food. This particular brand of chicken powder we're using is Totole or Totol, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's a granulated chicken powder that's used in a lot of restaurants. You see it in bulk as like a huge box. It's really easy to sprinkle into soups and sauces and stir fries. You can kind of use it like salt, it pinches really well. So it's a really useful, versatile ingredient. So we're just gonna bring this to a boil before we add our meatballs. All right, so our braising liquid is at a bare simmer, and now we're ready to braise our meatballs. And there's nothing special about this. We're just gonna arrange these straight into the pot. Try to fit them in as best you can. And that's all laid in. So these are gonna cook covered. I'm gonna reduce the temperature to about 208 on this induction burner, which is a bare simmer. And they're gonna cook for at least 2 hours and up to 4. Now at this point, you've got options for doneness on the meatball. At even like 1 hour of cooking, I would say these meatballs are ready to eat. Like they would be edible, they would be tasty, but with a longer cook, they just get even better and better. Say at 2 hours, you get a sort of classic meatball texture. Maybe if you're more familiar with Western or Italian meatballs, that would be the sort of vibe. At 3 hours, it's really tender, really moist. And at 4 hours, you get this super custardy, juicy, almost soup dumpling-like meatball that just falls apart in your mouth. And it's a really amazing, unique texture. So we're just gonna let these ride and we'll come back to them. All right, so our meatballs have been braising for about 4 hours. And we're just gonna give it a little check. So they look really good to me on the outside. As you can see, they've taken on this darker color. That's part of the red braise. And we're just gonna check for doneness. So I'm just gonna take a sharp wooden skewer and pick one of these and go right in. There's no resistance whatsoever. So to me, those are good. I know they're gonna be nice and custardy, really tender. So at this point, I'm gonna transfer these out to a landing spot. I got a sheet tray here. And then we'll continue by thickening our braising liquid so we can glaze these meatballs later. We'll go and transfer these out. And you really wanna be pretty careful when you're coming out of the pot. These are very tender, so just take your time. And because we've taken time to fry these meatballs before braising them, they really held their shape well throughout the braising process. If we didn't do that, they'd be a little more fall apart on you. Still be really good, but not nearly the same shape or the same color. Those are all 8 on a tray. These are just gonna hang out. Meanwhile, we're gonna build our braising liquid. All right, so we've got all 8 meatballs on our sheet tray. We've got our braising liquid. We're just gonna strain this out, put it back in the pot, thicken it, make a nice glaze, and then we're gonna glaze our meatballs to finish. All we gotta do is strain this. So I'm gonna go in to a bowl here. Set that aside, and we go back in with our braising liquid. To thicken this, because we've already used potato starch in the meatball, we're just gonna use some potato starch to thicken the liquid. So I've got some potato starch and some cool water. Just gonna mix those two together. Potato starch, like cornstarch, acts as a nice thickener in sauces and soups, things like that. It's got a little bit different characteristic. For me, it gives a little bit more of a glossy finish to a sauce. It's less of a starchy sort of texture compared to cornstarch. But if you didn't have potato starch on hand, you could definitely use cornstarch for this. In fact, if you didn't have potato starch at all to use with the meatballs, you could also use cornstarch. And most likely you would probably get away with a 1-to-1 swap on that. All right, so this is well distributed, mostly liquid, and then we're just gonna stream this in to our liquid. So we're just whisking this through. This is thickening really quickly. If I were to get lumps in this sauce, and if I wasn't careful about whisking, I could easily just take like a stick blender, get this nice and smooth. It would be a little bit frothy, and then I just cook it down slightly to get that air out. But so far, the sauce is looking well smooth. So whenever you're working with starches, like cornstarch or potato starch or tapioca starch, it's important to, after you hydrate them initially, to cook them over heat to gelatinize the starches. And that's really what you're leveraging here, is the gelatinization process to thicken the actual sauce. And if you didn't cook this through enough, the sauce wouldn't be fully thickened. It also might break on you down the road. So it's important to apply heat. Just be mindful with things like cornstarch and potato starch. It is possible to overcook them, so we're just trying to get this nice and thick, and then it'll be done. This sauce is pretty much there. It's coating the spoon, it's napping the spoon. I don't see many lumps, if at all. This is ready to glaze our meatballs with. We're ready to glaze our meatballs. It's pretty simple here. This is nice and thick still. Just gonna give it a little brief stir. And plop our meatballs back in. And then using a spoon, I mean, there's no real specific technique to this, but we just give them a nice turn. Now, because we took care to fry these meatballs up front, they're taking on a little bit more of that color. So if you think about it in layers, it's got a background of golden brown, and then when you lacquer that red braised sauce on top, it gets really deep brown. So it's a nice combination there. All right, so these are ready to serve. As far as serving goes, I'm just gonna keep these covered for a sec. Really traditional, again, we've got baby bok choy, and this would be typically a serving for about 2 to 3 people. We just line the outer rim of our plate, keep going along. This is a very, very traditional serving sort of style suggestion. Kind of want to keep everything equidistant to the center. Try to work in pairs that are the same size roughly. And you want to angle them toward the center as you move along. So I'm just turning the plate a little bit. It's a nice little bed, little landing spot for those amazing meatballs. And that's pretty much the setup. So now we're back to plating. I will take a slotted spoon. You could also use a regular spoon for this. Take some of our meatballs. All right, so we're actually gonna be plating for 3 to 4 people. And then lastly, kind of gild it a little bit. Spoon over our lovely sauce to get that extra shiny glaze. And the sauce here plays double duty because people are gonna really want to have this over their rice, so don't skimp on it. That's pretty much plated up. It's ready to serve. All right, let's taste this. So onto the plate. Ideally, you should be able to just break into this with your chopsticks. And yep, pretty easy right there. That's pretty insane. It's almost like a soup dumpling. It just like explodes in your mouth a little bit. And then you get a little bit of extra crunch on the back end from the water chestnut. Tons of aromatics, super tender, tons of fat, but it's not like coating your mouth in any sort of aggressive way. It's delicious. It's really, really good. And that's Lion's Head meatballs, done right. I'm Wikipediaing red braising.